A cheek swab from a man in South Carolina sits in a university freezer. Nothing about it looks unusual. But when gene scientists read the Y chromosome inside it, the result broke the human family tree. His father's line split off from every other man alive about 338,000 years ago. That is older than the oldest known fossils of our own species. What nobody knew at the time was that this man carried a genetic mark from a group of people that, as far as the bones go, never existed. So where did it come from? This story does not begin in a gene lab. It begins with a problem that scientists who study early humans had been quietly working around for the better part of 100 years. The bones we dig up and the DNA inside us were supposed to tell the same story. For a long time, they nearly did. Then the tools got sharper, and the two started to disagree. The man's name was Albert Perry. He was born in South Carolina sometime around the 1820s into slavery, and he was gone long before anyone could have guessed what his genes would one day show. Perry himself was never tested. He had passed more than 100 years earlier. What survived was his father's line, passed son to son, all the way down to a living relative who, years ago, did something completely ordinary. He mailed a cheek swab to a company that checks family history from DNA, just to learn about his own family tree. The sample went into a big collection of DNA records next to hundreds of thousands of others, and it sat there, nothing special, for years. Until a family tree researcher named Bonnie Schrack, who had taken charge of a project tracking one of the deepest branches of the tree, noticed that the marks on this one Y chromosome did not match anything else in the system, not a rare type, not an odd branch, something that sat below the whole known tree. Older than the root everyone had agreed was the root, she pointed it out. The sample made its way to the University of Arizona, to a lab run by the gene scientist Michael Hammer, where a scientist named Fernando Mendez led the work of reading it fully. What they found came out in 2013 in the American Journal of Human Genetics. The paper's title was plain, almost shy. It described an African-American father's line that added an extremely old root to the human Y chromosome tree. Said in plain words, it meant this: every man alive shares one father far back, a man gene scientists had nicknamed Y chromosome Adam, and the date for that man had just been pushed back by more than 100,000 years. The line was labeled A00. Its split from all other men came in at about 338,000 years ago. Think about that for a second. The oldest fossils of fully modern humans known at the time came from Ethiopia and dated to around 195,000 years. Even after a find in Morocco a few years later pushed the oldest members of our species back to about 300,000 years, the A00 date still sat on the far side of it. The father's line was older than the bones, older than the earliest face we would know as our own. That is not supposed to happen. A genetic line cannot be older than the species carrying it, unless the line came from somewhere else. This is where the story takes a turn that the scientists themselves were careful about, because the simplest reason for a Y chromosome older than your species is that it did not start inside your species. It was passed down, carried in from an older group that your ancestors met, mixed with, and took in. A group that gave its genes to the modern human line and then disappeared from the bones entirely. Mendez and his team raised exactly that chance in the paper, quietly, in careful words. The A00 line might have entered modern humans by mixing with an ancient group, one we have never named, one we may never have found a single bone from. There was something else strange buried in the math. For years, the textbook story had Y chromosome Adam living more recently than mitochondrial Eve, the woman every mother's line traces back to. The two were never a couple, never even alive at the same time, just fixed points in the math on opposite sides of our DNA. But the new date flipped the order. Suddenly, the shared father was older than the shared mother, and the neat balance that had comforted everyone for decades quietly fell apart, and the date itself became a fight. The first guess of 338,000 years had a lot of wiggle room, and other scientists pushed back hard. One new study the next year argued the real number was closer to 208,000. A later study landed somewhere in between, with a range of about 192,000 to 307,000. The arguments were technical, about how fast DNA changes and how you count the differences between strands of DNA. But notice what none of them did. None of them moved the line into safe ground. Even the youngest serious guess still reaches back to the edge of where modern humans are supposed to begin, and past it. Up to this point, the strange thing was a single chromosome in a single family line that traced back to one family. Easy to file away as just an oddity. That oddity would come back to matter more than anyone expected, but the family tree researchers kept pulling the thread. In the years that followed, the same A00 line showed up again, this time in living men among the Mbo and the Bangwa peoples of Western Cameroon. In one of those groups, it was not even rare. The line was not a one-off in one American family. It was a living branch of humanity, still being carried, thousands of years after it should have vanished, in the very part of Africa where our deepest roots are buried. That was about to stop being a story about one chromosome. In 2020, two scientists at the University of California, Los Angeles, took the problem somewhere much bigger. Arun Durvasula and Sriram Sankararaman were not looking at one man's Y chromosome. They were looking at whole sets of DNA, 405 of them, drawn from 4 West African groups, the Yoruba, the Mende, the Asan, and a group from the Gambia, all read through a public project that had recorded human DNA differences across the planet. Their problem was a hard one. Outside Africa, scientists can spot ancient DNA from old human relatives because they have sample DNA to compare against. We have Neanderthal DNA. We have Denisovan DNA. We can line a modern set of DNA up against those and see which pieces came from where. But for West Africa, there was no sample to compare against. No ancient human relative from the area had ever been read. The weather had seen to that. If something ancient was hiding in those sets of DNA, there was nothing on file to match it to. So they built a way that did not need a sample at all. A computer program that learns, taught to spot the math fingerprint that outside DNA leaves behind, even when you have no idea who it came from. They showed the program what ancient ancestry should look like in the math, then set it loose on the real sets of DNA and waited to see what it would flag. The version of human beginnings most people have heard is clean. One species rises in Africa, spreads out, and the rest is just people moving. But that was not the full picture the DNA was showing. Between 2 and 19% of the DNA in these West African groups traced back to a source that did not fit any known human ancestor, a group that had split off from the line leading to both modern humans and Neanderthals somewhere between 360,000 and just over a million years ago. And then, much later, somewhere inside the last 124,000 years, it had mixed back in. There was no skeleton attached to it, no skull, no tools, no grave, no name in any textbook. The scientists called it what it was, a ghost population. Named not for anything magical, but for the plain fact that it lives only in the DNA and nowhere in the ground. Up to a fifth of the roots of millions of living people, coming from a group of humans we cannot picture and have never dug up. That is not a mistake in the data. It was a clear signal, one you could measure again and again, found on its own across 4 separate groups, in sets of DNA sitting in a collection anyone could download. And some of that ghost DNA was not just hanging around at the edges, it was spreading. The team found long runs of this ancient DNA showing up a lot in the Yoruba and the Mende, bunched in certain parts of the DNA. When an outside gene survives and stays common across thousands of generations, it usually means one thing. It was doing something useful. The body kept it because it helped. Whoever these people were, something they carried was worth holding on to, and it is still being passed down today. That was the story coming out of West Africa. Behind the scenes, the same pattern had already been turning up everywhere else, and it changed the shape of the whole question. The ghost in West Africa was not the first unexpected ancestor we found inside ourselves. It was just the hardest one to see. By now, plenty of people know that humans outside Africa carry Neanderthal DNA, 1 to 4%, give or take, in everyone with European or Asian roots. The Neanderthals were not a made-up story or a myth. They were a real, separate kind of human, and our ancestors met them, lived next to them, and had children with them. Those children are part of the reason you are here. Then came the Denisovans, and the Denisovans are the closest thing in real science to the puzzle we keep circling back to. In 2010, in a cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia, scientists dug up a single piece of a finger bone, a tiny piece, from the hand of a young girl who had lived tens of thousands of years earlier. From it, a team at the Max Planck Institute, led by the gene scientist Svante Pääbo, pulled DNA and read it. The result did not match Neanderthals. It did not match modern humans. It belonged to a completely unknown kind of human, one that science had no name for, no skeleton of, almost no physical record of at all. We knew the Denisovans existed before we knew what they looked like. They were found as a set of DNA first and a people second, pieced together from a chip of bone smaller than a coin. Pääbo would later be given a Nobel Prize for the methods that made it possible. And as more sets of DNA came in, the Denisovans turned out to have spread across much of Asia, and to have met the Neanderthals too. One bone from that same Siberian cave belonged to a girl whose mother was Neanderthal and whose father was Denisovan, a first-generation child of 2 vanished kinds of human, found by accident in a cave. Like the West African ghost, The Denisovans left gifts behind. People living on the Tibetan Plateau today live at heights that would leave most of us gasping, because they carry a gene version that controls how the body handles thin air and low oxygen. That version did not develop in their modern human ancestors. It was traced back to the Denisovans, handed over at some point in the deep past, and it is the reason a whole group can live where the air should not allow it. And if that were the only layer, the picture would be strange enough. But the Denisovans themselves were carrying DNA from a group older than they were, a line that had split off from the rest of humanity so long ago that scientists simply call it super archaic, a ghost inside a ghost. We found the Denisovans hiding in living people, and then found something older still hiding inside the Denisovans, and we have laid eyes on neither. By the middle of the last 10 years, the shape of the problem was clear. Human ancestry was not a clean tree with a single trunk. It was closer to a braided river, with flows coming in from sources we had only ever found as math. The fossils we actually had made up only a small part of the people whose DNA we were carrying. The rest were ghosts. And this was not even the newest clue. 10 years earlier, the same Arizona lab and others had already found hints of about 2% ancient DNA in some African hunter-gatherer groups, from a group that split off around 1 million years ago. The clues had been piling up for years. The tools had just finally caught up to them. So where did this DNA come from? There is a careful answer, and there is a wilder one, and an honest version has to hold both. The careful answer is the one most gene scientists would give you, and it is not boring, even if it sounds calm. Africa is huge, and it is old, and for most of human history, its people were not one smooth, mixing group. They were scattered, partly cut off, splitting and joining again over hundreds of thousands of years. Some of those branches stayed apart long enough to become different in their genes, almost like separate kinds of human, before flowing back into the main line. Scientists have a name for this picture. They call it a structured population, or African multi-regionalism, and it suggests our species did not begin in a single place from a single group. It began across a whole continent, from many threads at once. The ghost in the West African DNA may not be a lost civilization at all. It may be a deep, branched-off African group that simply never left a fossil we have managed to find. And the missing bones are not as strange as they first sound. Turning into a fossil is rare. It needs the right conditions, the right soil, a body in the right place at the right moment, and then luck stretched across tens of thousands of years. Much of West and Central Africa is damp, and damp ground destroys bone. The places where these ghost populations most likely lived are some of the worst spots on Earth for keeping a skeleton. We are not missing them because someone hid them. We are missing them because the ground ate them. That is the careful view. There is another one, and it lives in a very different corner of the internet. For decades, a kind of out-there writing has pointed at exactly these kinds of strange findings. Ancient lines, sudden appearances, gaps the textbooks cannot fill, and offered a single, tidy answer. That humans were built on purpose. The most famous version came from the writer Zecharia Sitchin, who in the 1970s argued that ancient Sumerian writings described a group of beings he called the Anunnaki, who came from a planet he named Nibiru and shaped early humans for their own ends. Sitchin's translations have been thrown out by almost every serious expert on the ancient Near East. His readings of the old Sumerian writing do not hold up, and nothing in the DNA points to a made-on-purpose start for our species. That has to be said straight out. But it is not hard to see why finds like A00 and the West African ghost get pulled into that world. Look at what the real science is actually saying. There is DNA evidence of ancestors who left no bones, adding to us from before our species is supposed to have existed, carrying genes we kept exactly because they made us stronger. The facts are strange enough on their own that they do not need any added drama. The added drama finds them anyway. Everything needed to answer the real question is, on paper, already inside us. The ghost DNA is still there, inside living people, waiting to be read more closely. We just do not yet know what it is building toward, or what it will tell us once the tools get sharper than they are now. Because DNA can tell you that a group of people existed. It can tell you roughly when it split away, roughly when it mixed back in, and sometimes what its genes were doing once they arrived. What it cannot tell you is what those people were, whether they spoke, whether they buried their own, made tools, painted on walls, mourned the ones they lost. A ghost population is a shadow in the math, not a face. We know these ancestors were here. We know almost nothing about who they were. What we are left with is a strange thing passed down. Somewhere in the deep past of Africa, more than 300,000 years ago, there were people. They were human enough to mix with the ancestors of everyone reading their own DNA today. They handed over pieces of themselves that lived through the whole length of our history, through every empire and language and civilization that has ever risen and fallen, and those pieces are still flowing in the veins of people walking around right now. And then the people themselves disappeared so fully that the only trace they left behind is written in us. A man in South Carolina carried one of those traces his whole life and never knew it. Neither did his father or his father's father, back through every generation, all the way to a group of people that has no name. The real question was never just where this DNA came from. It is why we keep finding ancestors we cannot see. Every time the tools get better, the family tree gets stranger, and another ghost steps out of the math. We have found them inside West Africans, inside Tibetans, inside the Denisovans, inside ourselves. And the pattern suggests we are nowhere near done. There are almost certainly more of them in there, older and stranger than the ones we have caught, waiting for a tool good enough to pull them into the light. The swab is still in the freezer. The line still has no skeleton, and the people who gave it to us, whoever they were, are still out there in the only place they ever survived. Not in the ground, in the code.